Blood doesn't pool like they show on television. It spreads. It crawls across the linoleum, sticky and warm, finding the shallow grooves between the tiles. When they wheeled the Marine through the double doors, Maggie knew two things. He was already dead, and Gallagher was going to kill him again. Fluorescent lights in Trauma Bay, 4 always hummed with a sick, erratic buzz. Maggie pressed the heel of her hand against her right eye, trying to rub away the grit of a 14-hour shift. She smelled of industrial bleach, stale sweat, and the sour ghost of black diner coffee she'd swallowed over a trash can at 3 in the morning. Tuesday nights in the emergency department were usually a slow, miserable drip of minor lacerations and drunk tank clearances. Tonight was different. Sirens wailed in the ambulance bay, a jarring shriek that cut through the low, steady murmur of the nurses' station. The radio on the clerk's desk had crackled to life 10 minutes prior. Motorcycle versus concrete barrier on the I-95. Young male. John Doe, though first responders, found a set of dog tags in the debris. Vitals circling the drain. Maggie didn't feel a rush of heroic adrenaline. She just felt a heavy, dull ache settle deep in her joints. She snapped on a pair of blue nitrile gloves, the thin rubber snapping sharply against her damp wrists. She grabbed a pair of trauma shears, the heavy metal cold against her palm. Next to her, Dr. Richard Gallagher was aggressively tapping his pen against a steel chart. Gallagher was an attending physician who wore tailored scrubs that fit a little too perfectly, his hair held in place by an expensive gel that smelled faintly of peppermint and arrogance. He treated the trauma bay like a high-stakes exam where the patients were expected to bleed in a predictable, orderly fashion. "ETA is 1 minute, Gallagher said, not looking up from his phone. "Let's prep for massive transfusion. Get the rapid infuser primed. If he ate the concrete at 70 miles an hour, his pelvis is dust." Maggie didn't answer. She was busy checking the suction canisters, listening to the hollow hiss of negative pressure. She had been an ER nurse for 11 years. She knew the difference between a textbook trauma and a messy one. Textbooks didn't scream. Textbooks didn't void their bowels on the table. The double doors smashed open. 2 paramedics shoved a rattling gurney into the room. The smell hit Maggie instantly, a thick, nauseating cocktail of raw copper, vaporized gasoline, and the sharp stench of voided bladder. 1, 2, 3, transfer. They hoisted the broken body onto the trauma bed. The man, a kid really, maybe 22, was a catastrophic mess of torn denim and mangled tissue. His left leg was bent at a sickening, impossible angle. His chest was scraped raw, a massive expanse of bruised purple and angry red road rash where his leather jacket had shredded away. Embedded in the meat of his collarbone, half fused with dried blood and asphalt, was a silver chain. A U.S. Marine Corps dog tag. Miller, Dean. "All right, people, listen up," Gallagher announced, stepping up to the head of the bed, positioning himself exactly where the lighting hit his face best. "Blunt force trauma. Let's get him on the monitor. Maggie, establish bilateral large-bore IVs. Let's get O-negative hanging now. Give me a liter of lactated ringers wide open." "Ta!" Maggie was already moving. She ignored the noise, the shouting EMTs, the squeal of the gurney wheels rolling away, the frantic beeping of the cardiac monitor as it struggled to find a rhythm. She focused on the Marine's right arm. The skin was clammy, cold as wet clay. It was a terrible sign. It meant his body had already shunted all the warm blood to his core in a desperate bid to keep his organs alive. She tied the tourniquet tight, slapping the inside of his elbow, searching for a vein that wasn't already collapsed. She slid a 14-gauge needle into the flesh. A weak flash of dark, Deoxygenated blood crept into the hub. She taped it down fast, her movements mechanical, devoid of emotion. If you let yourself feel anything for the meat on the table, you burned out. Maggie had burned out 5 years ago. She was just operating on muscle memory and caffeine now. Pressure is 60/40, respiratory tech Dave called out from the corner, untangling a mess of oxygen tubing. Heart rate is 140, he's tachycardic, oxygen sats dropping, 88%. He's hypovolemic, Gallagher said confidently, staring at the monitor instead of the patient. He's bleeding internally, probably a ruptured spleen or a shattered liver. Push the fluids, Maggie. We need to get his pressure up before we can scan him. Maggie squeezed the plastic bag of fluids, forcing the liquid into Miller's arm. But as she leaned over the bed, she felt something brush against her forearm. It was the Marine's hand. His fingers, slick with his own blood, twitched. They clumsily, desperately hooked around the fabric of Maggie's scrub top. The grip was shockingly weak, the dying grasp of a drowning man. Maggie froze for a fraction of a second. She looked down at his face. His eyes were open, rolled back slightly, the whites bright against the soot and blood smearing his cheeks. His lips were parted, trembling. He wasn't crying out. He was drowning in silence. Maggie tore her gaze away, forcing herself to look at his chest. It wasn't moving right. Gallagher was shouting orders, calling for an X-ray tech, dictating notes to the scribe. But Maggie was staring at Dean Miller's bruised, battered torso. The right side of his chest was rising, but the left side was perfectly, terrifyingly still. The skin around his neck looked swollen, the veins bulging outward like thick blue cords under the pale skin. Jugular venous distension. Maggie leaned down, placing her bare ear inches from his mouth. She could hear the wet, desperate struggle for air, but when she grabbed a stethoscope and slammed it against his left pectoral, there was nothing. No breath sounds, just a hollow, terrifying silence. "He doesn't have a belly bleed," Maggie said, her voice low, raspy from disuse. "Excuse me?" Gallagher snapped, finally looking away from the screen. "His trachea is deviating to the right." Maggie pointed a stained, gloved finger at the Marine's throat. "He's got JVD. No breath sounds on the left. It's a tension pneumothorax. His lung collapsed, and the pressure is crushing his heart. Pushing more fluids is just going to drown him faster. I am the attending in this room, Maggie." Gallagher's voice went icy. It was a tone he reserved for medical students who asked stupid questions on rounds. "He is tachycardic and hypertensive from massive blood loss. We need to volume resuscitate. Do your job and push the blood." The monitor shrieked a high-pitched, continuous alarm. "Pressure is tanking," Dave yelled over the noise. 40 over palp. Heart rate dropping. 90, 85. Miller was crashing. The trapped air in his chest cavity was building with every agonizing mechanical gasp, pushing his heart and intact lung out of the way, strangling his cardiovascular system. The IV fluids Maggie had just pushed were backing up in his veins, nowhere to go. "He's going into PEA arrest," Gallagher said, a sudden edge of panic cracking his polished veneer. Pulseless electrical activity. The heart was trying to beat, but there was no blood left to pump, or in this case, no room for it to pump. "Start compressions. Push 1 milligram of epi." Maggie didn't move toward the chest. Compressions wouldn't do a damn thing. You could crack every rib in this kid's chest, but if you didn't let the trapped air out, his heart would never refill. He was suffocating from the inside out. "He needs a needle decompression," Maggie said. Her hands were shaking now, not with fear of the blood, but with the sudden, violent realization that if she didn't do something, This 22-year-old was going to end up in a body bag in less than 3 minutes. She turned her back on Gallagher and reached for the trauma cart. She ripped open the top drawer, her fingers scrambling through the plastic packaging until she found it. A 14-gauge angio-cath needle. It was long. It was thick. "What the hell are you doing?" Gallagher barked, stepping around the bed, his face flushed red with anger. "I gave you a direct order. Start compressions." "If I do compressions, he dies," Maggie fired back. She ripped the sterile paper off the needle, her thumb popping the plastic cap off. She could feel the sweat beading on her upper lip, stinging her eyes. She wasn't a hero. She was a tired woman with a mortgage and a bad back, and doing what she was about to do could strip her of her nursing license before the shift was over. Insubordination in a code was a career killer. Gallagher reached out and grabbed her wrist. His grip was surprisingly strong, his perfectly manicured nails digging into the cheap fabric of her sleeve. "Stop! You're just a nurse!" the doctor shouted, his voice echoing off the ceramic tile walls, slicing through the chaotic noise of the trauma bay. The room seemed to freeze. The respiratory tech stopped pulling tape. The scribe lowered her pen. For one agonizing heartbeat, the only sound was the sickening beep, beep, beep of Miller's heart failing. Maggie looked at Gallagher's hand on her arm. Then she looked up into his eyes. They were wide, frantic, hiding a deep-seated incompetence behind a wall of academic arrogance. He didn't know what to do. He was following an algorithm that was failing, and he was terrified. Maggie wasn't terrified. She was pissed. She ripped her arm out of his grasp with a violent jerk. "Get away from my table," she snarled, a low, guttural sound that didn't even sound like her own voice. She didn't wait for his reaction. She spun back to the bed. Miller's face had gone from pale to a mottled, dusky blue. The oxygen starvation was reaching his brain. Maggie didn't use iodine. She didn't have time to prep the site. She dragged her gloved fingers down the center of Miller's chest, finding the sternum, then walked her fingers left, counting the ribs. First rib, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Her hands stopped trembling. A cold, absolute focus took over. She positioned the tip of the heavy needle against the taut, bruised skin of the Marine's chest. She didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the hospital board, or Gallagher's inevitable write-up, or the fact that she was operating completely outside her scope of practice. She drove the needle down. It wasn't a clean slide, like in the practice dummies. She felt the pop of the thick skin, the gritty, sickening crunch as the metal scraped past the edge of the rib bone, and finally, a sudden give as the needle punctured the pleural space. There was a sound, a loud, wet hiss, like a punctured tire rapidly deflating. Immediately, a spray of dark, aerated blood shot out of the end of the catheter, splattering across the front of Maggie's scrubs and dotting her cheek with warm crimson. The smell of copper hit her nose again, fresh and sharp. She pulled the metal stylet out, leaving the flexible plastic catheter in his chest. For a terrible, stretched-out second, nothing happened. The monitor remained a sluggish, dying crawl. Maggie stared at Miller's blue lips, a sickening wave of doubt washing over her. God, what if I was wrong? What if I just killed him? Then the Marine's chest hitched. It was an ugly, spastic movement. He choked, a wet gargle sounding in the back of his throat. And then he took a breath, a real deep, mechanical pull of oxygen. Maggie stared at the monitor. The sluggish, wide complexes on the screen began to tighten. The heart rate spiked from 40 to 60 to 90. "Pressure is climbing," Dave whispered from the corner, staring at the screen in disbelief. 80 over 50, 90 over 60. Saturation is coming up. 92%. The color was slowly bleeding back into Miller's face, the dusky blue fading into a sickly but living pale white. The bulging veins in his neck melted away as the pressure off his heart was released. The trapped air had vented. His heart could pump again. Maggie stood frozen over the bed, the bloody metal stylet still gripped tightly in her right hand. Her breathing was ragged. She could feel a single drop of the Marine's blood sliding slowly down her cheek, tickling her skin, but she couldn't bring herself to wipe it away. Gallagher was standing on the other side of the bed. He was completely silent. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes fixed on the plastic catheter sticking out of the boy's chest. The chest that was now rising and falling in a steady, life-sustaining rhythm. He looked from the catheter to the monitor, and then, finally, he looked at Maggie. The arrogance was entirely gone from his face, replaced by a hollow, shameful shock. He opened his mouth to speak, to assert dominance, to yell, but nothing came out. Maggie dropped the bloody needle onto the metal tray with a sharp, dismissive clatter. She looked across the broken body of the Marine, meeting the doctor's eyes. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She just felt that same heavy, dull exhaustion settling back into her bones, heavier than before. "He needs a chest tube," Maggie said, her voice flat and dead. She turned, walking toward the sink to wash the blood off her face. "You might want to grab the kit, Doctor, before he bleeds out from the spleen you were so worried about." Cold water blasted out of the break-room faucet, hitting the stainless steel sink with a hollow drumming sound. Maggie plunged her hands into the stream, ignoring the freezing temperature, and pumped a heavy glob of harsh pink antibacterial soap onto her palms. She scrubbed aggressively, her fingernails scraping against her own skin until it turned a raw, angry red. The blood was gone, but she could still feel it. That was the curse of trauma nursing. You could wash off the biological matter, but the phantom weight of it lingered on your cuticles for days. Back in Trauma Bay 4, Environmental Services was already mopping the floor. The heavy scent of industrial lemon disinfectant waged a losing war against the lingering metallic stench of Dean Miller's near death. The Marine was currently on an elevator, heading up to the operating room, heavily sedated, a chest tube successfully placed between his ribs, draining the remaining air and blood into a plastic box that bubbled like a macabre aquarium. Gallagher had vanished the second the transport doors closed. He didn't say thank you. He didn't acknowledge what had happened. He just stripped his gown, threw it into the red biohazard bin with unnecessary force, and power-walked toward the doctor's lounge. Maggie grabbed a rough brown paper towel, drying her hands until the paper shredded. Her lower back throbbed, a dull, familiar spike of pain radiating down her sciatic nerve. She leaned against the counter, staring blindly at a corkboard plastered with outdated union notices and dietary guidelines. She didn't feel like a savior. She felt hollowed out, scraped clean with a melon baller. "Maggie." The voice was quiet, raspy from decades of smoking. Maggie turned. Brenda, the night shift charge nurse, stood in the doorway. Brenda had been navigating emergency departments since the AIDS epidemic in the 80s. She had a face like a worn leather saddle and a bullshit tolerance of absolute zero. Currently, she held a yellow carbon copy form in her hand. "He wrote you up," Brenda said softly, stepping into the break room and letting the heavy wooden door swing shut. Maggie let out a dry, humorless exhale. Of course he did. How long did it take him? 10 minutes? 12, Brenda corrected, looking down at the paper. Insubordination. Operating outside the scope of nursing practice. endangering a patient by disrupting the physician's code algorithm. He's demanding an immediate suspension pending a review board. Maggie closed her eyes. The fluorescent bulb overhead flickered, buzzing like a trapped hornet. She thought about her mortgage. She thought about the property taxes due in 3 weeks. She thought about how old she was to start over in a clinic, checking blood pressures for retirees who complained about the wait times. "The kid was in PEA arrest, Brenda," Maggie said, opening her eyes. Her voice was flat, devoid of pleading. She was too tired to beg for her job. His trachea was practically touching his right collarbone. If I pushed one more unit of blood like Gallagher ordered, I would have blown his heart out. He had a tension pneumo. "I know," Brenda said. She folded the yellow paper in half, then in quarters, her thumbs pressing hard against the creases. "Dave told me. The scribe told me. Hell, the janitor probably knows you saved that boy's life. But you know the rules, Mags. We don't diagnose. We don't prescribe. We don't perform surgical interventions. We are the hands, not the brain. That's how the hospital lawyers see it." "So I should have let him die to protect Gallagher's fragile ego?" "Yes." Brenda looked up, meeting Maggie's gaze with a brutal, unwavering honesty. "If you wanted to keep your license without a fight, yes. You follow the attending's order. The patient dies. Gallagher signs the death certificate. The Morbidity and Mortality Committee reviews it. Maybe gives Gallagher a slap on the wrist for missing the signs, and life goes on. By saving him, you broke the chain of command." Maggie rubbed the heel of her hand against her temple. A migraine was blooming behind her left eye, sharp and hot. "Are you sending me home?" Brenda hesitated. She looked at the folded paper, then at Maggie's exhausted, pale face. She walked over to the trash can, stepped on the pedal, and tossed the yellow form inside. "I'm short-staffed," Brenda muttered, pulling a pack of nicotine gum from her scrub pocket. "I've got 3 boarders in the hallway, a suspected meningitis in room 2, and a psychiatric hold who just bit security. I didn't see any write-up. If Gallagher wants to push it to administration tomorrow morning, he can do it himself. Finish your shift." Maggie nodded once, a curt, tight movement. She didn't say thank you. In the ED, gratitude was implied by surviving the night. She walked out of the break room, the heavy door clicking shut behind her. The corridor was freezing. The ambient noise of the ER washed over her again. The rhythmic beeping of monitors, the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum, a distant cough. Maggie tightened her ponytail, grabbed a fresh pair of blue nitrile gloves from a wall dispenser, and walked toward room 2. The world kept bleeding, and she had to keep patching the holes. 4 days passed in a blur of chart audits, defensive emails, and a silence from hospital administration that felt heavier than an actual reprimand. Gallagher had indeed taken his grievance up the ladder. Maggie was forced into a grueling 2-hour meeting with the director of nursing and the chief of trauma. They played the telemetry strips. They looked at the post-op chest x-rays. The math was undeniable. Maggie had been explicitly warned. She was placed on a 6-month probationary period, 1 more deviation from protocol, 1 more unauthorized intervention, and her license would be reported to the state board. She took the punishment with a blank face, signed the disciplinary forms, and clocked in for her scheduled double shift. It was 4 p.m. on a Thursday when Maggie found herself standing on the 4th floor. The surgical intensive care unit was a different universe compared to the emergency department. Downstairs was a war zone, loud, filthy, and unpredictable. Up here, it was a cathedral. The lighting was soft and dim. The floors were spotless. The air smelled intensely of chlorhexidine and fresh cotton. The silence was only broken by the rhythmic, mechanical sighs of ventilators and the soft, melodic chimes of IV pumps. Maggie rarely came up here. ER nurses liked to stabilize and ship. Seeing what happened to the patients after they left the bay broke the necessary emotional barrier. If you saw them recover, you started to care. If you started to care, the ones who didn't recover would tear you apart. She stood outside the glass sliding doors of room 412. Dean Miller was awake. He was propped up at a 45-degree angle in the massive, mechanized ICU bed. He looked like he had been put through an industrial meat grinder. The right side of his face was swollen and painted in ugly, mottled shades of yellow, purple, and sickly green. His left arm was wrapped in a bulky plaster cast. A thick, clear plastic tube still snaked out from between his ribs, connected to the bubbling Pleur-Evac box on the floor. He was staring blankly at the muted television mounted on the wall, chewing slowly on a piece of crushed ice. Maggie didn't know why she was there. Maybe it was morbid curiosity. Maybe it was a desperate, selfish need to see tangible proof that the disciplinary mark on her permanent record was worth something. She placed her hand on the cold aluminum handle of the glass door and slid it open. The sound of the television news drifted into the hallway. Miller slowly turned his head. His left eye was swollen shut, but his right eye, a piercing, pale blue, locked onto Maggie. He didn't speak. He just watched her as she stepped inside, letting the door slide shut behind her. Maggie stood at the foot of his bed, suddenly feeling incredibly awkward. She crossed her arms over her chest, gripping her own biceps tightly. "How's the pain?" she asked. Her voice sounded too loud in the quiet room. Miller swallowed the ice. It sounded painful, a dry clicking in his bruised throat. "Like a truck parked on my chest," he rasped. His voice was gravelly, ruined by the endotracheal tube that had been down his throat for 3 days. "But the Dilaudid helps." Maggie nodded. She looked at the chest tube box. The fluid draining out of him was a healthy, serous pink now. No longer the dark, terrifying red of a massive hemorrhage. "Lungs sound good?" "Respiratory says I'm breathing at 98%, Miller replied. He shifted slightly, grimacing as the movement pulled at the stitches in his side. He let his head fall back against the pillows, his single good eye still fixed on her. "You're the one." Maggie froze. "Excuse me." "Dave, the guy who comes in to make me blow into that stupid plastic tube to clear my lungs. He talks a lot." Miller coughed, a wet, painful sound that made him clutch his ribs. "He told me what happened. He said the doctor was going to drown me in my own blood. Said you jammed a needle into my chest and told the doc to go to hell." Maggie felt a sudden, uncomfortable flush of heat creep up her neck. She looked away, staring at a monitor displaying his steady 72 beats per minute heart rate. "Dave talks too much." It wasn't like that. It was a medical decision based on clinical presentation. "Bullshit," Miller whispered. Maggie snapped her eyes back to him. The young Marine offered a lopsided, painful smile, the cracked skin on his bottom lip splitting slightly and welling with a tiny bead of fresh blood. "I know how the chain of command works, ma'am. I know what happens when a grunt tells an officer they're wrong. You catch hell for it. You take the shrapnel." Maggie didn't say anything. She stared at the kid. He was 22 years old, a baby. But looking at the calm, steady acceptance in his good eye, she realized he had probably seen more horrific things in the last 4 years than she had in a decade of nursing. He understood the terrible, necessary math of survival. "I didn't do it to be a hero," Maggie said, her voice dropping to a low, defensive murmur. "I did it because I was tired of cleaning up bodies that didn't need to be dead. Doesn't matter why you did it," Miller said softly. He reached out with his good hand, his fingers pale and trembling slightly from the narcotics, and tapped the thick plastic tubing jutting from his ribs. "I'm breathing. My mom is sitting in the waiting room down the hall, drinking terrible coffee, instead of picking out a casket. So, whatever write-up you got." "I'm sorry." Maggie felt a sudden, sharp tightness in her throat. It was an alien sensation. She swallowed hard, forcing it down, burying it under years of practiced clinical detachment. She uncrossed her arms and gripped the plastic footboard of his bed. "Just make sure you use the incentive spirometer," Maggie said, her tone shifting back to the brisk, authoritative cadence of a seasoned nurse. "You don't want pneumonia on top of the broken ribs. It's a miserable way to spend a month." Miller chuckled, a dry, raspy sound that quickly turned into another wince of pain. "Yes, Ma'am." Maggie turned toward the door. She didn't want to linger. The longer she stayed, the heavier the emotional toll would be, and she still had 10 hours left on her shift downstairs. The ER was already calling her name, a chaotic symphony of alarms, sirens, and human misery waiting to be triaged. She opened the glass door, stepping back out into the hushed, sterile hallway. "Hey," Miller called out, his voice barely carrying over the hum of the machines. Maggie paused, looking back over her shoulder. The young Marine wasn't smiling anymore. The cynical, tough guy facade had slipped, revealing the terrified, broken kid underneath. He looked directly into her eyes, stripping away the hospital politics, the medical jargon, and the bureaucratic bullshit. "Thank you," he said. Maggie held his gaze for a long second. She didn't smile. She just gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. She turned her back to the glass, shoved her hands deep into the pockets of her scrub pants, and walked toward the elevator banks. She was exhausted. Her back ached. Her license was hanging by a thread, and she was almost certainly going to get yelled at by an angry drunk before midnight. But as the elevator doors chimed and slid open to take her back down to the trenches, Maggie realized her hands weren't shaking anymore. Did Maggie's raw, unapologetic fight for survival resonate with you? Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought on the front lines, but in the sterile, high-stakes hallways where breaking the rules is the only way to save a life. If this gritty glimpse into the reality of trauma medicine kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who appreciates unsung heroes, and don't forget to subscribe for more intense, grounded medical dramas.